Assassin. Back in the days of 1.0, this class was a fan favorite. It had a fast-paced playstyle with a satisfying gameplay loop that rewarded players who could utilize its kit to the fullest with immense damage output. Out of the 1.0 classes, Assassin had the most amount of skill expression by far, and its high skill ceiling kept Assassin mains hooked. So when the Spellbound update announced that it was splitting every class into 3 new archetypes, players were excited to see what Wynncraft had in store for Assassin. When Assassin's archetypes were finally revealed, people had their eyes set on Shadestepper, which seemed to have been the spiritual successor to 1.0 Assassin. The archetype was described as a glass cannon that was able to dish out devastating burst damage. But when people got their first hands on the archetype, many were left disappointed. Although Shadestepper retained Vanish's original effects of invisibility, increased damage, and speed, it was now tied to a 5-second cooldown. But what about the rest of Shadestepper's ability tree? Well, unfortunately the rest of Shade's nodes failed to help the already initial premise of a bursty glass cannon. Shade was riddled with abilities that just kinda fucking sucked. Looking at you, Death Magnet. Or on paper seemed really strong, but in practice failed due to requiring weaker mobs to farm kills off of, which many endgame fights didn't even have. With enough setup, Shade could deal high damage in a single hit, but with a 5-second cooldown between bursts, any other competent archetype could output more damage in that amount of time for way less effort and without some of Shade's other drawbacks. Shadestepper has received many buffs since its release, including the addition of new nodes, but these buffs were evidently not enough. The archetype still suffered from the same fundamental issues. However, over the course of Wynncraft's 2.1 update, Shadestepper has received a series of buffs that has not only addressed many of its issues, but has also propelled it to being the best assassin archetype. That's also partially because Trickster and Acrobat were nerfed in the same patch as it got buffed. But as a result of its terrible reputation, the significance of these buffs has been overlooked by many. So in this video, I'll go over the main changes and explain how to play Wynncraft's most underrated archetype. Introducing Shadestepper, the embodiment of unseen execution. Before I said that Shade is the best assassin archetype, but this is with an asterisk, an admittedly very big one. Shade is the strongest if you have the aspects. If you're unaware, aspects are items that you can get from raids that modify certain abilities in the tree, and Shadestepper received the strongest ones by far. Although the only one that is absolutely required is the tier 1 mythic aspect, having the other ones makes a pretty big difference in terms of both damage and quality of life. And I'll make sure to cover those as we go. But the most important buff actually came in the form of a new node that would completely change the way Shade is played. However, before we get to that, it's important to understand the rest of Shade's kit and how it stacks up, starting with Backstab. Shadestepper's signature spell turns multi-hit into a single hit that does double damage if it hits behind an enemy. But how the back detection works is something that a lot of people don't know. See how this is a backstab? Well, did you know that this is also a backstab? How the game counts a successful backstab is a comparison between the direction you are facing and the direction the mob is facing. And backstab happens to have a small backwards hitbox, meaning that if you have your back facing towards an enemy, you can proc a back boosted stab because you are facing the same direction. This is referred to as front stabbing, and although it's inherently more dangerous, since you need to be standing even closer to mobs than you already are, there are some advantages. For one, if you are by yourself, you can proc back boosted stabs without needing to use Vanish to de-aggro mobs. Front stabbing is also what allows you to land backstabs on stationary targets like the Cannon Colossus, the Eye, and Annie. Another thing about backstab that's important to note is that you don't need to be facing the exact same direction as the mob. It's not exactly known how the backstab direction comparison is done, but an interesting explanation was proposed by fellow Shade players. Now, it could be wrong. After all, it's just a game theory. But backstab has something called a success angle, and by default, this angle is 70 degrees. But what does this mean? The theory states that if the difference between the direction you and the mob are facing is less than or equal to the success angle, it counts as a backstab. And you can further increase the success angle with the aspect of Unyielding Fate. It's also recommended that you use the aspect of Redoublement which increases both the front and back hitbox of Backstab. Combined, these two provide nice consistency and quality of life. Backstab on its own doesn't do that much damage, which is where the rest of the tree comes in. Shade has numerous damage buffs that you're meant to stack on top of each other to ultra boost your backstabs. Starting with... Marks are pretty simple to explain. Mobs can have up to 6 marks, an aspect of the calling card further increases the cap by up to 3. And you deal 10% more damage to an enemy for every mark it has. Smoke Bomb will apply 1 mark to every mob it hits each Smoke Bomb tick. And it's recommended to grab Sticky Bomb, which lets you stick your bombs. Wow, that's fucking crazy. Onto enemies so they don't just, walk out of it. Sticky Bomb also has great synergy with Better Smoke Bomb, which lets you throw your Smoke Bombs much further. And it increases Smoke Bomb AoE by 1 block. By combining these nodes, you have constant mark applying on moving targets without really doing much. Spin attack can also apply marks, 1 per spin, 2 total, but just having a Sticky Bomb active is usually enough. But if you need marks quickly or have the mana to spare, spin is great for that. Finally, marks decay at a rate of 1 every 10 seconds. Marks can also be consumed from every enemy you hit with a spin attack while in Vanish to summon your Nightcloak Knives. For every 2 marks you consume, you get 1 knife, and each knife copies 8% of your damage. Knives used to have one major flaw. If you consumed more marks, instead of adding onto your knives, it would replace them altogether. For example, if you had 3 knives and consumed 2 marks, instead of having 4 knives, you would only have 1. Now by default, you can have up to 5 knives, and this goes up to 8 with the aspect of the dagger silhouette. But with a mark cap of 6, it was impossible to get the 10 marks needed for 5 knives unless there were additional mobs to consume marks from. And after 40 seconds, all your knives disappear. But in a recent patch, consuming more marks now adds onto your knives, and fully refreshes the timer instead of replacing your knives. Meaning you can now easily hit the knife cap and maintain it during fights. So, quick recap. Surprise Strike will boost your next hit in Vanish by 120%. A back boosted stab deals 100% more damage. Marks increase damage by up to 60%, and knives copy 40% of your damage. But there's one more thing. One more way to boost your backstab even further. The final red node for Shade Stepper. Satsujin. If an enemy has 4 or more marks, your next multi-hit will deal 100% more damage. Satsujin has a 15-second cooldown, but unlike other abilities with a cooldown, Satsujin does not have a global cooldown. It has a cooldown per enemy. This makes Satsujin really strong for medium HP enemies or things with multiple phases. But because it is a per mob cooldown, the game can't tell you when this cooldown refreshes. But by the time you're watching this, it's possible that Satsujin receives a change to how its cooldown functions. Now the main problems people had with Shade Stepper is the setup and poor overall DPS. Sure, you can hit the funny big number, but how practical is it if it requires setup and can only be done every few seconds? Time loss is damage loss, especially when other classes have constant damage uptime, that ultimately eclipses Shade's burst. In 2.1 the setup is a non-issue. Marks and knives are easier than ever to maintain, but what about the overall DPS? Even with all these buffs, Shade is still stuck with the 5-second Vanish cooldown. 5 seconds with no speed, resistance, strength, and no way to de-aggro mobs. But what if I told you that in 2.1, they got rid of the cooldown? With Shadow Siphon, Shade Stepper's newest node, landing a back boosted stab reduces the Vanish cooldown by 1.75 seconds, and this ability has 0 cooldown. Meaning if you hit 2 backstabs, you reduce the Vanish cooldown to 1.5 seconds. Combine this with the Mythic aspect, and the cooldown becomes effectively 0. Meaning you can Vanish again, and 2 more back boosted stabs, and repeat the process over and over again. This is referred to as Backstab Chaining. With Shade, we've established that you want to stack as many of your damage buffs as you can. Apply marks at Smoke Bomb or Spin Attack, cleanse marks to summon knives, reapply marks. From here, you can start Backstab Chaining. Vanish, 2 backstabs, repeat. And make sure to refresh knives whenever the timer is yo or you have a yo number of knives. And keep marks up, which just requires an active sticky bomb. The last thing I want to talk about regarding chaining is how you dash. After resetting your cooldown with Shadow Siphon, you have a few options when it comes to how you dash. The safe option if you want to get away or avoid any damage is to use the yoink dash you get on the ground to either dash away or dash up. And you can also do this to dodge attacks in general. Both are good, but there may be scenarios where one is better than the other. Now, if you are with other players, aggro is most likely on someone else, in which case, you might want to dash forward instead to chase the boss who is chasing the other guy. The other aggressive option you can do is to yoink straight down. By yoiking down, you'll stay in place when you vanish. Typically you do this whenever a mob is stationary, but if you're crazy enough, if the mob is aggroed onto you, you can combine this with front stabbing. This is called down stabbing and it shits out damage, but as you can probably imagine, it can be very risky. Now I'm going to briefly talk about weapons because they can play very different from each other. The first one you probably had in mind for Shade was Weathered. Weathered has the highest quality of AI for Shade by far. This is due to high walk speed, which is very useful in stuff like TNA, as well as the major ID. Normally while in Vanish, you do not regen any mana or HP, but with Roving Assassin, you can! Although in terms of raw numbers, Weathered gets beat out, Weathered has the least amount of downtime due to walk speed and is overall just the most comfortable weapon for Shade. I would recommend it for beginners. Now if you just want to nuke everything, I'd recommend looking into Oblivion. Oblivion is played as Spell Steal, and if you don't know what that means, it's just a spell build that relies on Mana Steal to sustain. Mana Steal works a lot better than regen on Shade since, as I mentioned before, you don't regen mana in Vanish. And Oblivion happens to have a lot of Mana Steal, and it's super sealed by default so you don't need to teardrop. The minus dash cost is also pretty nice since dash is a part of your natural spell cycle, and it also helps with positioning. If you're playing Oblivion or Spell Steal or Mixed Mana Shade, in general you can get your melee hit in after your 2 backstabs. It's also recommended to pick up Dagger Proficiency 2 for the extra melee range. And if you want even more melee range, you can also use the Aspect. The last weapon I'll talk about is Nirvana, which is my go-to weapon for Shade. Now Nirvana is a mana regen weapon, and I've just said that unless your name is Weathered, you can't regen mana in Vanish. So what gives? Well, if you throw enough mana regen combined with Transcendence, it's fine.
Hey, stop! Why?
Usually fine, that is. If you want to play mana regen Shade but want more damage than Weathered, I'd recommend Nirvana. But outside of Nirvana and Weathered, I would not recommend pure mana regen. If you are Backstab Chaining, you don't spend enough time outside of Vanish for your mana to regen, and Shade is already pretty mana hungry. My own personal reason for using Nirvana is that it's fun, and it's the only one that can sustain my deranged ass playstyle. Other weapons probably work fine for Shade, but if I had to pick one, I'd pick one of these. In the description of this video, I'll have a few sample builds for each of these weapons that you can try out, as well as a blank build with a Shade tree that you can mess around with. Although Shade still has some problems, I think it's in a pretty good spot right now. If it's your first time playing Shade, it may feel a bit awkward, and you might even get owned really bad. It's probably one of the harder archetypes in the game, but if you're willing to put in the time to learn and master it, you can do some pretty crazy things. Something I've noticed while making this video is that there's not a lot of Shade gameplay on YouTube, so I decided to make a playlist for my Shade Stepper solos, with the plan being to eventually have a video for every major boss in the game, including bosses before endgame. That way if anyone who's trying to learn Shade gets stuck on a boss, they'll have some footage they can watch over to possibly help them. Finally, shoutouts to fellow Shade players HornetFan221 and Bad Name for helping me get footage and being there for me to consult. After years of mediocrity, Shade Stepper can finally live up to its name. Although it may not be 1.0 Assassin, it has found its own way to be a fun and engaging archetype, finally delivering on its initial premise of a playstyle that can deliver. I'm so fucking tired!